I get sad when people are like, oh, if they see an Asian player and they're like, oh, that's the next Jeremy Lin, or if they're like, oh, that's the next Simu, like eventually it won't be such a novelty and you won't be the token Asian.
The CCYAA, of course, is a real pioneer in galvanizing, particularly the Chinese-Canadian community around sport and specifically around basketball. And just recently, your organization hosted just an extraordinary event, and we're really honored that you did it here at the University of Toronto about basketball and about Asian Canadianness and Asian Americanness.
Yeah, it really started with an idea back in 2018 where I'd met a young, strapping actor named Simu Liu, who had just landed his role on Kim's Convenience. And I was like, what are you about? And he's like, I'd love to see an Asian actor, have a male lead in a romantic, comedy where, it's mixed race, and I was like, oh, cool. Like, I'd love to see where there's like Asian athletes not being made fun of, in the NBA, and like, we should just talk, now that he's BFF with Jeremy Lin, he's like, we should do something for him. I know all these YouTubers and stuff like that in California. Let's bring them to Toronto and do a charity fundraising basketball game. And so we did it in 2019 in the middle of a parking lot at a night market. And by now, Simu has definitely progressed. He's like Asian Avenger, and he's like, are we doing this? And he
Marvel movie star.
Yeah, we're like, are we doing this? He goes, yeah, let's do it.
I don't know how this actually happened, but we wound up on the same team.
I forced my way on. I forced a trade and just told him I need to be on the red team.
It definitely wasn't something that I said. No, me facing off against Jeremy Lin, that's not a question that I personally need answered. In all of my basketball fantasies, I always wanted to be Jeremy's teammate.
Honestly, like I always talk about, basketball has done more in terms of teaching me how to be a person than anything else, and then the game, the X's and O's and skills, like it just taught me communication, leadership, servanthood, like teamwork, just so many different, there's just so many life lessons, resilience, perseverance, like chasing of your dreams, like confidence. Even to this day, it's something that like every athlete, and definitely me, will struggle with. And so, man, the game has brought so much to my life. And I just think, when I think about like the next generation, which is, something that's big, on my mind these days, it's can we enrich the next generation? Can we enrich their lives with access to things like sports?
I played at North Toronto Collegiate Institute. I played all through high school. And then I got into playing in some of these Asian rep circuits, which would take us all across North America. Wow. Sometimes we would even tour over to Asia. And it kind of reached a point where I started wanting other Asian kids to have that opportunity. And this is right around 1995 when the Raptors came to Toronto. Yep. We decided to start a nonprofit at that point called the Canadian Chinese Youth Athletic Association. Yep. And based off of that, we started growing the game domestically for that community. Right. And that's kind of where basketball has taken me, because it wasn't just about playing, but through that opportunity in the nonprofit, I had a chance to be a reporter in the NBA for a few years. It took me all over the world. I got to work in the 2000, NBA All-Star Game, 2016 All-Star Game. Amazing. But the game has definitely given me a lot beyond just playing.
I know, Tak, you were on your way to the NBA, right?
Yeah. It was a.
You're the inspiration for Jeremy Lin.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Well, I can't even remember when I first started to play basketball, but I was always out on the basketball court. Yeah. As even in elementary school. Yeah. And that hard asphalt. Yeah. With no net hanging, just a rim. Yeah. And I was
in California.
This is in California, growing up in Berkeley, California. So.
And did you play like competitive ball as well then?
Well, yeah, I think I was pretty good, and this is where the NBA thing comes in. So I played competitively in junior high and all the way up to 15, and but then I figured out at the end that 13 was my peak. Right. After that, there's also something in the Bay Area, coming to the race issues. Yeah. a Japanese American basketball league.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it started at what was called D League, the elementary school, all the way up to high school.
Yeah.
So I continued to play there.
Okay.
And then even in college, there was Asian League. So I think these are really important in the Asian community. And some of the players are actually really very good.
Yeah, I never played hoops. I was terrible as a kid. I actually, I couldn't even do a layup really all that well because I think I counted the steps too much in my head.
Yeah.
What about you, Janelle?
Yeah, I played through high school. I've been this tall since grade 7.
Wow.
And so actually there were coaches in Markham that were actively trying to recruit me to come to Markham High and play for their team just based on height and race, I would argue. You look like a basketball player. Do you want to come play for us?
So you're born and raised in Toronto?
Yeah, I'm a Scarborough kid.
So I was actually raised in Brampton.
Yeah, I mean, elementary school is kindergarten to grade 8. I was the only Chinese kid in my class. I remember as a kid, some of my class, like when we're little kids, some of my friends wouldn't even know what rice is.
Yeah.
Like they literally, like you're just a kid, right? You wouldn't know any better. And that's what it was like growing up.
Yeah, and and it's the accumulation of those small micro things, right? Because you never forget them. I mean, as seemingly inconsequential at the time, I remember, someone saying to me, well, you don't sound Chinese when you're on the phone. But now again, it's literally one sentence, probably said to me, 25, 30 years ago. But I haven't forgotten it.
I think about my own childhood and think about representation, think about visibility. I don't think my son will understand being, minority on TV is not something that happened when we were growing up. It was a very rare occurrence. So for me, I take that with a lot of pride, knowing that not even just for my son, anybody else who is a minority, just if they by chance are watching TV and just my face pops up even for a split second, I think what's important to me about it is it normalizes that a job like this is not reserved for a specific type of demographic. There's no reason why somebody who is Asian, South Asian, Black, any other ethnicity can't be on TV. That's something that's very important for me, bringing a son into this world. I want them to understand, there's no reason why you can't.
The basketball world, I think the world more generally, lost someone when Bill Russell passed away. And I recall, around 2020 in the Players Tribune, he wrote a piece really lamenting how the state of American society, in his view, in terms of race relations and so forth, had not improved. That kids were still growing up in a terribly racist society, that leaders continue to be people who harbored racist attitudes and racist stereotypes and so forth. And it was a very pessimistic view, right?
I also felt, quite pained to learn about his death, because I remember he was such a huge figure, symbolically as well as literally, physically. And that remembering about Boston itself, the way and the racist character of the city towards Black people, of course, and with housing covenants and all the rest, but towards Asians as new immigrants, refugees from Vietnam and so forth. And it's really kind of a horrible place to begin a career as a pathbreaker in race relations, So I was really reminded of that. Although now, of course, Boston has a Chinese American mayor, Mayor Wu. So maybe, things have changed, but not as much as they should. And in some ways, they've reversed, I would say. Yeah.
I don't know if it's improved, but it's a different game right now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things with the Bill Russell story, obviously, is some of the harrowing tales of when he first started in Boston, and a story that stands out in everyone's mind is, of course, the story about how upon returning to their home, it had been vandalized, and the people had destroyed the trophies, and in fact defecated in his bed and so forth. I mean, just the most inhuman kind of treatment, right? This. Something that you Tak, you might have referred to in some of your work as like a vulgar racism, right? One based on that kind of violent exclusion. But the evolution of it also strikes me, the evolution of racism and the evolution of systemic racism has in many ways brought about what you've called in some of your work, polite racism.
You know, prototypically, vulgar racism would be more like apartheid or segregation, blatant racism. Black people are inferior. Right. You know, Asian people are like this biologically. Yeah. But polite racism disavows that, says we're all equal, right. You know, as human beings. But, right. You know, those people stink, or those people are the ones who are terrorists, or those people, they're just lazy, you know, and, but, you know, I'm not racist though, but that's just the way. So it kind of switches over to a culturalism, and I think that's one of the things that's happening now as well, that the discrimination gets based more upon culture, the type of culture.
Yeah.
Another nuance to that polite racism is when it comes in the form of compliments, right? Yeah. With this idea of the model minority Asian Canadian, and that idea of, you know, when you say those people are like this, well, one of the stereotypes is, you know, Asian Canadians will be natural leaders, are smart, are, you know, excel and are ambitious. Mm-hmm. And those
work
kinds,
hard.
Exactly, mm-hmm. hardworking, trustworthy, and those kinds of stereotypes, and also related to sport and basketball. Sometimes the flip side is the, you know, ineptness at physical activity. That actually can limit the potential. And, you know, when we think about the relationship between Asian Canadians and Black Canadians, it can also, you know, in some cases promote Asian Canadian from athlete to coach, whereas the Black athlete might not get that same opportunity because they are having the opposite stereotype applied to them.
Just recently, I was interviewed as part of a project on anti-Asian racism. And they asked me this question, have you ever experienced anti-Asian racism? I said, you know, I went through my memory and, you know, sure, I'd been called lots of different things and so on. Never been beaten up or anything like that. And so I said, you know, I reported no. Right? But I thought to myself, no, that can't possibly be true, right? So then I started thinking about all of the different times in which, for instance, you know, something didn't happen or I didn't make a choice because I feared, for instance, potential backlash or something like that, which are, you know, they're unreported, right? But it's part of that kind of polite ecosystem where it's unreported, it's not an incident, yet it's something that has struck, you know, very close to me and something that I, you know, recognize as, well, wait a second, I wouldn't even be thinking about that if I weren't a visible minority. So you on your Twitter feed, you have a pinned tweet there, and I think it's a very powerful statement.
If you really read between the lines in that post, that's a letter to my parents. It's a letter to my parents. So I think a lot about, you know, my own experiences might not have been adverse, but I always think back to my parents' experience growing up here. My mom was 5 when she moved to Canada. And her experiences, I can hear, they still to this day scar her. And she has some very negative feelings towards certain people. And you can't take that away from someone like that when it happens to you at such a young age, right? So, you know, I'm a first generation Canadian. My parents busted their ass to put me in a position to succeed in whatever manner that I decided to pursue. And that post for me is really talking to a lot of my friends who are also first generation Canadians, and just giving them the understanding that, hey, look, like, we share something very unique as first gen Canadians, immigrant children of immigrant parents, that we have the privilege of seeing our parents struggle. I take it as an honor that I got to watch my parents struggle, because that instilled like the determination, the commitment to really going after something and knowing that it's not going to be handed to me if it's something I want. It's like, you know, like, dream big, sure, but like, there's a very long road, especially being Chinese Canadian, to make something like that happen.
So let me put this out there, and I'd love to get some of your thoughts on this. I mean, one of my favorite films, and I've encouraged my students to watch it, Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle, which I just love. I think it's one of the most brilliant films because it's an Asian stoner film, right? It completely explodes all of these kind of myths and so forth. But there is this one scene in the film which I think to most people would be completely unremarkable, but for me was incredibly impactful. And it was the scene where Harold and Kumar, Harold is Korean American, Kumar is South Asian American. And I think Harold needed to use the phone or something like that. And they were standing outside a gas station. And Kumar says to Harold, he says, we'll just use the phone in the gas station. And they both turn and they look in there and they just see a bunch of sort of, white guys, teenagers, kind of rabble-rousing, making fun of the South Asian shopkeeper. And Harold just says, no, I'll just go across the street, right? And again, it's literally a 3-second scene. But for me, I completely understood how he felt. That's the kind of sort of polite racism that I think is experienced every day that is unremarked, unreported.
Well, the sad thing is, like I've had a chance to hang out with these YouTubers named the Fong Bros, right? So they've lived in Seattle, California, and New York, and right now they're based out of New York. And so they're actually running around teaching situational awareness classes in their communities for seniors to say, if you're walking down the street and you see this, you should cross the street and walk on that side of the street. You should carry your keys in between your hands in case this happens. Like, they're actually proactively teaching this type of behavior because they're actually getting beat down in the streets in New York versus out in California. Not saying that that's definitely happening in places like San Francisco and the Chinatowns and stuff. They're saying how there's a certain segment of people that are concerned about glass ceilings, polite racism, and we're trying to survive on the streets. That's an interesting dynamic in itself when you're just thinking as a human being, what am I trying to do to just get by on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, and there can be a class divide that's also along ethnic lines sometimes, and so those who are more wealthy are going to have different concerns than those who are trying to survive. I think the Asian Canadians are one of the most economically divided groups, right? That there are those who are mainly working in factories, blue-collar kinds of jobs, and trying to survive with their own businesses. And then there are those who are quite affluent and they have absolutely different concerns and are all experiencing racism in different ways.
So you wrote the report for the Ontario University Athletics Association on racism, right? Yeah. Racism in sport. In what ways is this conversation around vulgar racism versus polite racism, how does that play out in some of the findings that you had in that report?
Well, we had one section of the report that we just called Experiences of Racism because we wanted to document for those who said that they don't see racism, that maybe they're naive, but they don't know where it is or how it manifests. We wanted to give them some concrete examples. Yeah. And there have been, I think hundreds of reports in Ontario across different sectors around what racism looks like, but none in the university sports sector. So, the experiences are everything that we've been talking about so far, from especially around COVID, really extreme student athletes being denied housing, experiencing racism on their teams or from other teams. So some of the kind of vulgar and violent kind, as well as exclusions. But one interesting factor is that there are disproportionately more East and South Asian coaches and administrators than there are athletes.
Your CCYAA, Chinese Canadian Youth Athletics Association, one of your core sports is basketball. Is one of the metrics that you're looking at actually that kind of change? Is one of the ways in which you assess the impact of your organization to see it reflected more generally in the sport? Is that something you consciously do?
I'm cracking up because I'm around a bunch of academics who are very closely measuring and statistics and looking at the academic
can you share your
hypothesis.
data with us sometime? I'd like to.
We were not that scientific, but it was at the beginning. It was about creating spaces for young people in the Chinese community to play organized basketball because we just felt like there wasn't kids weren't making teams. If you're not making a team, you're not playing in the high school system, you're not playing in the college system.
Right.
Fast forward to like past the 2010s,
Yeah.
where basketball is now the most popular sport in China
Yeah.
and de facto like in Asia. There are kids absolutely playing rep, like your son.
Yeah.
There's absolutely kids playing in college right now. So we've kind of shifted our mandate now towards getting kids off screens and getting them more physically active, and also looking at the representation piece. But I will say that if that's a loose metric of whether we've succeeded or not, I say that we've had, because kids are now playing mainstream. And quite frankly, they don't need to play in an Asian league to play now. There's plenty of places that they can play, which is a good thing. And we talk about role modeling too, in terms of like, and I talked to Jeremy Lin quite a bit about this.
Yeah.
And he's a ball dominant point guard.
Right.
And basically, how do you get that point where now you've seen somebody like him do something like that?
Yeah.
So it just seems possible now to a young person that I could associate myself with that guy.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have to look like Kobe Bryant. I can look like Jeremy Lin, and I can run a pick and roll, and I can score 38 points in Madison Square Garden. Now, look, it's part of your reality in terms of what you're projecting.
But Jeremy Lin would also say he doesn't want to be remembered as, you know, the first or the only. It reminds me of like when, you know, Masai Ujiri was congratulated on becoming the first, you know, Black NBA executive, and he says, no, it actually angers me that I'm still the only one.
You know, for me, you know, child of an immigrant family, I grew up feeling like I didn't quite belong as well. And so, you know, I think I'm very honored to be playing a part in that conversation now, and hopefully, you know, also in a way that holds the door open for others, because it really isn't just about Jeremy or just about myself. It's about a continued celebration of success and continuing to move the progress forward.
By the time like I leave this earth, if you know, I get sad when people are like, oh, if they see an Asian player and they're like, oh, that's the next Jeremy Lin, or if they're like, oh, that's the next Simu. Like, to me, eventually, by the time I leave this earth, I hope it's not like, oh, that's the next Jeremy Lin. It's just that's who that kid is, and there's so much representation that just because you're Asian doesn't mean you get pigeonholed to the one Asian player or the one prominent Asian actor. You know, like, I think that concept, because I was Yao Ming. I was called Yao Ming my whole life growing up, and I just wanted to be Jeremy Lin. And there's so many other kids out there who play basketball who don't look like us, and they get the chance to be themselves, and they don't have to be the next only one person, right? And so eventually it won't be such a novelty, and you won't be the token Asian.
People often forget, or usually people don't even know, that the person who broke the color line in the NBA was Japanese American.
Right.
You know, Wat Misaka. So he played for University of Utah and won the NIT championship in 44 and 47.
Right.
You know, but the thing is, then that path has to be broken over and over again, right?
Yeah.
So this is the thing. This is why I think, as a historian, history is important. It's in the 1960s, 1966 actually, that William Peterson writes about the model minority myth. And people have pointed out that it's no accident that this occurred precisely in the civil rights movement, because it was said that, well, if Asians could make it, then why don't black people make it? Why don't brown people?
Referring to Japanese Americans.
Just specifically referring to Japanese Americans, and that has a global dimension to it as well. You know, because the way I think about it, Japan was becoming the global model minority.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the model minority myth, and Peterson wouldn't have referred to it as a myth, right? He thought this was empirical, right? The model minority. It's since been referred to as a myth because of all the things we've talked about. And what strikes me is, you know, being really frustrating again about that, is that the standard bearer then is whiteness, right? That somehow that's what the ambition is.
And it's linked with the colonialism and capitalism, you know, that proximity to whiteness, you know, that very idea suggests that it's an ascendancy, it's also an aspiration to upper class, it's an aspiration to power.
Yeah.
When I was doing media with the Raptors in the late 90s, if there was an Asian that made it onto TSN or Sportsnet or something like that, their voice would change. You know, the way they looked would change. It would be suit and tie and everything. And, you know, and I was like, I don't see myself in that person. But then now you're at the point where you see Alex Wong and Will Liu, who walk in with flip flops, you know, and like wearing like Chinese Hong Kong T-shirts and stuff like that, and talking the way they talk, and they're the #1 Raptors podcast in the country.
I agree with you 100%. And I mean, that podcast, I think, is revolutionary in that it is reaching totally different communities. And it's actually allowing the sort of mainstream sports brands grow their profile in ways they never imagined. But, you know, early on, I remember asking Alex, I said, did you pitch that idea, right, to the network? Did you say we're going to shape our podcast around our experiences as Chinese Canadians, and the stories we tell are going to be stories that really resonate with us? And I remember him saying that, no, we didn't pitch that, because, you know, you don't pitch that idea, right? You just do it. What Will Liu and Alex Wong and others, and what the sorts of things we're talking about now, is actually demonstrating is that diversity actually is excellence. But it's only now that we're actually seeing that, right? I mean, that's beginning to explode the model minority myth.
I've been thinking so much about this moment of anti-racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Muslim, so forth. We can't just talk about the bad stuff. There must be some hope, right? You know, so much of my own work has been about race, has been on more the negative side.
On the despair,
but, you know, let's go back historically and think about the different kinds of alliances we have had with different people, you know, with diverse people. And that's part of the hope that we're talking about, that kind of excellence that doesn't necessarily have to pass through whiteness.